Good morning to our viewers here in the United States, and good afternoon to our viewers in Europe. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual discussion. The Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24th has had a major impact on businesses active in the region and on the global economy as a whole. After an initial trickle, many Western firms are leaving Russia or have already done so. Others have reduced or paused their activities in Russia. The first to leave were major oil companies, with technology firms and professional service providers following suit. The chemical company BASF decided almost immediately after the invasion not to expand its business in Russia and also in Belarus, and it has since decided to wind down the company's remaining activities in both countries by the beginning of July 2022. But the issues are not limited to the region. The war in Ukraine has disrupted energy flows and supply chains. BASF recently warned that it could be hit by fallout from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as well as measures introduced in China to curb the spread of COVID-19. And so I am delighted to welcome ACG Board member Michael Heinz. He's the chairman and CEO of BASF Corporation and a member of the board of executive directors of BASF SE. He's with us today for a discussion about the impact of the current crisis on the German economy and on the global economy as a whole. His bio has been posted to the chat in case you're interested in reading up on him. Michael, herzlich willkommen.
Thank you very much, Steve.
So I am delighted to see you today. I'm very happy to have this conversation. I think it's a very timely conversation. And I thought we could start by talking a little bit about how BASF has been impacted. And then we'll widen the aperture and talk about the German economy as well as the global economy more broadly. So to help us sort of start and have a common jumping off point to really frame the discussion, can you tell us a little bit about how BASF has responded to and been affected by Russia's invasion of Ukraine as it began in late February?
Yeah, thanks, Steve, for the question. So, first of all, let me clearly state our position. We certainly condemn the Russian government's war of aggression against Ukraine. That's absolutely unjustifiable. It violates international law and our values as an organization, because we stand for freedom, we stand for democracy, and also for respect for human rights. So you mentioned it at the beginning that we very early said that we will not do any new business anymore. And we recently have announced that we will withdraw from Belarus and from Russia beginning of July 2022. The impact on our business overall is very small. We only had about 1% of our sales in Russia and Belarus, so it really plays a minimum role. We are making one exception though, and that exception is really that we will continue with our food production or business that enters into the food production arena. Yeah, but that has to be assessed on a case-by-case basis.
So, can you talk a little bit about what exactly it is that BASF does in regard to food production, and what the company is doing in the region to support food production? Because I think obviously the reason for doing that, the rationale for doing that, is growing concern about a food shortage in those countries that are affected, but also more globally, because Ukraine and Russia have been considered to be the bread basket of the world, particularly the third world. And so I'd be really interested to know a little bit more about your business in that area and this exception to the rule.
Yeah, the concern of a global food shortage is real. And let me first frame this with just a couple of numbers. And you mentioned that Ukraine and Russia are the bread baskets of the world. They're not really the bread baskets of the world. They're the bread baskets of Europe, but they do a lot of exports into, like you said, third world countries. So if you just look at some of these numbers, number one in the world in terms of wheat production is China. They produce about 135 million tons. Then you have India. They produce around about 110 million tons. And you probably all have heard that India had this unprecedented heat wave in the past. On May 13th, so just roughly 14 days ago, the government banned all private wheat exports. Then number 3 in the world is already Russia. They produce 86 million tons. And then number 8 in the world is the Ukraine with 25 million tons. Now that is production. When you look at exports, Russia makes up around 30% of total wheat exports. Like you said, a lot of it going into developing countries. In the Ukraine, 9 to 10% of the total wheat exports. So they are important grain exporters. And what we see right now is that the wheat could be planted prior to the war. And most likely it will also be harvested. But at least for the Ukraine, they might not be able to ship it. So time is running out to export many millions of tons of grain out of the UK before the new harvest has to be taken in. And that's just because the Russian forces continue the blockade of the country's Black Sea ports. And export via truck or rail is limited just because of this sheer amount, but also of infrastructure problems. Rail, for example, has a different track width in the Ukraine, and you would need to unload and reload your goods outside of the Ukraine. So for us, it was important as a company at least to make sure that we provide the seed and agrochemicals to enable the production of grain. We have gotten quite some criticism for that, and there are some instances where you're doomed if you do and you're doomed if you don't. But in 2023, there will be a shortage. And then the poor countries, in particular in Africa, will have an availability problem, but also an affordability problem, because I think that the affordability problem is even worse, because if you look at the wheat prices as a result of this crisis, and as a result of India announcing not to do any exports, so the wheat prices per bushel have doubled. So there is a real threat of famine.
Mm-hmm. And so obviously you said at the outset that BASF as a company is very critical and has condemned the war, but it is, and it's pulling back. It's making an exception when it comes to things that you do in Ukraine and in the region that have to do with food production. Is that sort of your way of then also saying we see a even greater crisis on the horizon that has global implications, and here's actually an area where we can help by continuing to provide the seed and
the agrochemicals,
chemicals, the petrochemicals, in order to facilitate that production where it's allowed to happen? Because of course, because of the conflict, one of the things that I have been reading in the New York Times over the past few weeks is that some farmers are not able to farm their land, even though it's arable land at the moment, because it's been mined or it's been damaged as a result of the war itself. So the farmland is contracting a little bit, not hugely. But you're able to say, we can provide some support to at least facilitate growth and production. It's then other hurdles like getting it out,
yes.
And that will be a bigger problem.
Yes, exactly. I mean, when you look at what are some of the options, when you look, options, let's say globally, what you could do is you could reduce the mandatory blend of bioethanol in gasoline. Some of the rich countries could release some of the grain reserves, or in Europe, you could actually forego these mandatory crop rotation programs, or use some of the set-aside areas which are used today for beneficial insects, etc., in order to increase food production overall. But it's probably still will not be enough. Now, my information, though, is from the people that we still have on the ground in UK and Russia, that yes, some of the planted areas have been impacted. But like I said, the impact is more on the silos are full and they cannot send out the grain. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And which means that they don't have then any space, to storage the harvest that they're harvesting very soon.
Mm-hmm. So one more question about your withdrawal from Russia and Belarus, you said that your business there has been fairly small. I think you said just 1% of your overall business is in those countries. And I'm assuming that that's in terms of sort of sales of products. But BASF, of course, is a global company that needs um, resources, ingredients for the various things that you put together. And one of the issues has been that Russia, of course, is a source of some rare materials, some precious materials. Do you have needs as a firm for products from Russia that are inhibited by the conflict at the moment?
There are some products which are in shorter supply when you look at nickel, when you look at phosphor, when you look at a host of other things. But so far, we have been able to find alternatives for all those things except for gas.
Mm-hmm. And that was where I wanted to go next, because I think that the big issue, particularly for Germany, has been the disruption of energy flows from Russia, and the war has not only sort of upset global supply chains, but it has also really made many people much more aware of Germany's energy dependency, and BASF has been particularly impacted by that. So I think it would be really interesting to hear from you about how the company is dealing with the reduction in gas coming from Russia at the moment, because that's been a very important product that you have needed.
Yes, Steve, there is no reduction in gas flows yet from Russia. There is a voluntary reduction of German offtake, let's say,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
So but let's maybe first provide a little bit of background, because I think it's important to put this in an overall context. And that is, you almost have to go back into the 70s. Yeah, back then there was a German chancellor by the name of Willy Brandt, and he started a new policy towards the east, and put it into the context of, they called it in German Wandel durch Handel, or in English, I think it's change through trade. Mm-hmm. And at the time, Germany received about 50% of its gas. And let me just, for the time being, stay with gas and not include oil or coal. So about 50% of its gas from the Netherlands and 50% from own domestic production. Now, in the following years, the impacts from Russia increased to about 30%, and domestic production started to decline, while consumption through economic growth in Germany actually went up. So at the time, Russia and Germany together built really a network of pipelines from Russia, but also throughout Europe. So thousands of kilometers of pipelines that were also paid by Russia to supply actually Europe also with gas. So politically, I think a lot was achieved during that time through this policy, Wandel durch Handel, and the Cold War ended. It led to the unification of Germany, and all of that would not have been able with these closer time. So let's fast forward a little. Germany also decided to get out of coal, out of nuclear energy, so the importance of gas really increased, while the production of the Netherlands, where we got initially our gas from, and the production of Germany decreased. And ultimately, this led to the fact that around 55% of Germany's gas supply was coming from Russia. And I think it's also important to mention that fracking gas out of the US was not available until 2003, 2004. So for a long time, there was no option for Germany on LNG gas. And once it became available, the gas was sold in Asia, as Americans were able to get a much higher price for that LNG than in Europe. So when you now look at the situation of BASF, we consume 4% of the German gas consumption. That's a huge amount. And it's fair to assume that the gas that BASF receives is equivalent to the Russian share of gas in Germany. We do not know for sure, as we buy gas through gas distribution, and you don't know from where the molecule itself came from, but it's fair to say it's probably 55% as well. And we use 50% of the gas we receive for power production at our production site, which is the largest chemical site in the world. And just to give the listeners a sense of magnitude, it has the size of Lower Manhattan. And we have 3 power plants there. They produce 6.3 terawatt hours electricity. And I just looked it up this morning one more time. This is equivalent to the country of Moldova, or a little more than 1% of the electricity generation in Germany. And the other 50% of the gas is used for our chemical synthesis. So gas for us is very, very important. And if gas supply were to drop below 50% of what we normally receive, we would have to shut down our 200 plants because the grid would not be able to provide the electricity we need to maintain the Verbund. And then this is not only a threat for BASF, but for all downstream industry in Germany and Europe that rely on BASF raw materials, and there is no easy substitution. Now, the threat of a complete shutdown for BASF has diminished as Germany has started to reduce the share of gas coming from Russia, probably from 55% to around about 35%. So they substituted with more gas from the Netherlands and gas from Norway, and we probably can still reduce this a little bit further. But at the end of the day, there is no full substitution until the end of 24, the beginning of 25, even if you consider floating LNG terminals and the increase of some of the gas imports that I just spoke about. Mm-hmm. So it's that was just one impact, and then the other impact for us is cost, obviously.
Yeah, and so I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the cost side of it, because we've got a couple of viewer questions. One of whom actually focuses on the cost. He notes that there have been historically high gas prices even before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and so Europe has been experiencing sort of a bit of a price shock when it comes to gas and electricity costs. And this, of course, has been affecting not only consumers, but also manufacturers, so companies like BASF. So if you could talk a little bit about that that price increase, that would be, I think, very valuable too.
Yeah, sure. So so one burden is really the Damocles sword on supply, but the other thing is certainly cost in Europe. When you look at the Henry Hub price in North America, the average last year was $3.10, if I remember correctly, per million BTU. And now you are above $7 per million BTU. But in Europe, the price has jumped to over $30 per million BTU. So for BASF, compared to the first quarter of 2021, we had some additional costs in our European sites of around 900 million euros. And if we compare it to the first quarter of 2020, it was even an additional 1.1 billion euros. Mm-hmm. So in order to mitigate this, we have implemented several measures. So we are obviously trying to pass on these gas prices. To a large extent, that's possible. Unfortunately, that is also fueling inflation, which down the road will hurt us. And then wherever feasible at our European sites, we are substituting natural gas with alternative feedstocks, but that's not everywhere possible. It's possible, for example, in our plant in Schwarzheide, where we have a combined heat and power plant, so we can substitute here natural gas with other oil-based feedstocks. Mm-hmm.
So sticking with gas for just a minute, another one of our viewers has pointed out that there's been a lot of pressure on Germany to cut off its use of Russian gas and oil and coal as well, but particularly gas. And as you just outlined, BASF is very dependent on gas in general to do what it does, and consumes a fair amount of Russian gas. How have you as a company been dealing with some of this pressure that Germany has been under to really sort of pull back when it comes to the gas consumption?
Well, I think first of all, we try to, I think a lot of people don't really understand what it means to cutting off gas. So we always said that coal and petroleum, those things are liquidly traded and they can be easily substituted. And that's what already has been announced. So By the end of the year, we don't plan to import any petroleum out of Russia anymore. So you see steps are taken, and that is also possible. For gas, it's just not possible. It's just not possible. So Germany, also to make maybe another point of reference, Germany uses 50% of its gas for households, and the other 50% of the gas goes to the industry. So if you were to cut 50% supply, you can either supply the households, or you can supply the industry. And in Germany, this is regulated by a law which is called the Notstandsversorgungsgesetz. I don't know exactly how this translates into English.
Yeah,
probably emergency law or something like that. And that foresees that private households and the medical sector would have preference over industry.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. I'd like to maybe shift gears a little bit and talk about global supply chains. I mean, obviously the gas piece is an important piece, but for a global entity, a global company like BASF, global supply chains are also very, very important. And there's been a great deal of disruption, not just because of the war in Ukraine, but also with the pandemic. To what degree have you been caught up in some of the challenges facing global supply chains? And to what degree have you been trying to make your supply chains more resilient to these kinds of external events that can create disruptions?
I tell you, last year has been, and even this year has been, a special year because never before I had seen supply chain people in the boardroom of BASF. That just tells you how important that topic has become. So I think there is within BASF, there was always a little bit of resilience built in, because our philosophy has always been to build our plants where the markets are. So we have a high share. We normally have a pretty high share of own manufacturing productions in the countries where we operate. For example, in North America, 66% of our shares, roughly 70% of our sales that we have in the US, it is out of own manufacturing in the US, also with raw materials out of the US. But you cannot cover this 100%. Obviously, we had also supply chain disruptions. When you go to a website which is called shiptracker.com, then just last month you saw more than 300 ships stuck in front of the biggest harbor in the world, which is freight harbor in the world, which is the harbor in Shanghai. And there are things that no matter how resilient you plan, you cannot foresee. But it tells you one thing: you have to have you have your eggs in more than one basket. And I think that is going to be the philosophy going forward.
So maybe related to that, I mean, it sounds pretty smart to have production close to the markets that you're serving, which it sounds like you were doing even before these specific disruptions. But has the current crisis or crises caused you to consolidate your activities at all? And part of the reason why I'm asking is because we're hearing a lot these days about onshoring and friendshoring and sort of pulling production closer to home and certainly closer to markets that one's serving. Has there been any thought about that at BASF?
Well, I mean, you have to remember that when you build, let's say, a chemical plant, this is not like building a warehouse, right? I mean, building a chemical plant, that takes years in planning and then also years in production, because in order to get into cost competitive type of structures, I mean, you have to have a huge size of plants these days, at least for the chemicals that we produce. So you cannot just say, I'm gonna, dismantle plants in one area and then build it up in another area. At the same time, however, I mean, going forward, we will have to take this into equation when we do our capital planning.
Mm-hmm. So it's obviously part of the agenda for the future, right? In terms of lessons learned from this period, if you will.
Yes, I think I'm a little bit concerned when we talk about going back to closed borders, and doing everything in one country rather than optimizing, let's say, production all around the world. So I'll give you an example. I mean, it probably doesn't make sense. I mean, I'm just a very simple example. It probably doesn't make sense to build soybeans in Germany. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I mean, we import soy protein from Brazil because in Brazil, I mean, the conditions are much better than they will ever be in Germany. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But yet you would still kind of try to balance things a little bit better than in the past, and that for us is particularly also when it comes to the source of raw material. I mean, I think there was a tendency for a long time to go to single suppliers. Mm-hmm. And relying on single suppliers, and then when you have disruptions in supply chains, that obviously is going to hurt you.
Mm-hmm. So I actually want to bring one of our viewers in here from New York, a new board member, Tara Hariharan, has a question I think that fits in right at this point, since we're talking about sort of the global marketplace, but particularly dependency on particular regions. So Tara, I think your mic is on.
Thank you so much, Steve. And thank you, Michael, for all of your comments. Just to follow up again on your earlier remarks regarding China, I would love more details on how BASF is being affected by the current lockdowns in China and how you are preparing for those contingencies. And on a broader, more long-term scale, it seems like China is planning to increase its stockpiles of important commodities, including, various metals, food, etc. I'm just wondering how this long-term plan of China to stockpile commodities and resources will benefit your company, but at the same time may further limit the shortage of food and commodities for the rest of the world, including the poorest nations and the emerging market nations, considering we're already facing these supply constraints right now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. I mean, first of all, it's not just China that is kind of hoarding, let's say, food these days, because I mentioned at the very beginning that one resolution to the problem, let's say, of a potential famine in third world countries would be that all countries around the world, all of them, would start to release a little bit their food reserves. Yeah, so I think we should not just look at China per se. But then coming back to the other question in terms of like, how is our Chinese business right now? What are some of the contingencies that we have, et cetera, et cetera. So when you look, I mean, and I would put this basically in the context of the global implications that we have right now, which is more than the war in Ukraine. Right now, we have basically three elements to deal with. So we certainly have the war in Ukraine, which is putting a damper also on the economic development in Europe, because if I remember correctly, then 8% of the European GDP, or roughly 60 billion euro for Germany alone, were the ties to Russia. This is going to have an impact. And then at the same time, we have this zero COVID strategy in China, and that caused the economic growth in China also to soften. So in the first quarter 22, in China, we had a year-on-year GDP growth of 4.8%, compared with 4% year-on-year growth in the first quarter 2021. But then what we saw is after the first quarter, particularly in April, a huge drop, because more than 20 cities in China were in partial or in full lockdown. What we see, however, also within BASF, that May is doing much better. When I look at our numbers, then I see that in comparison to prior months, we have a huge increase. In comparison to prior year, we are still trailing a little bit behind. But it means that the Chinese market is very elastic. So, and as cities are coming out of lockdown, when Shanghai comes out of lockdown with more than 20 million people, that has a huge impact, obviously. So we are seeing a sharp increase to prior months. And when it comes to China, for us as a company, I mean, 50% of the world chemical production by 2030 is in China. So the Chinese market is very, very important to us. And that's why we are also in the process of planning and implementing a seventh Verbund site of the BASF in China, because contrary to what I said before, own manufacturing share being large in many regions, in China for us it's still very low. And then the third element I want to mention here, even though it's not part of your question, but that is really the automotive crisis, and that's driven by the global chip crisis and also by logistical problems, and by the war in Ukraine, because in Europe most of the wiring harnesses are being produced in Ukraine, and here we close the loop again to the conflict in Ukraine, and as a result of that, there is a company that makes market study on automotive production. They're called IHS Markit, and they have estimated this year's global automotive production will only be 81 million units, which is a reduction of 3 million units overall.
So, Mike, that's actually a perfect segue, because we've talked a fair amount in this conversation about BASF itself, and I'd like to maybe talk a little bit about the impact of the war and sort of the world we live in at the moment more broadly. And I wanted to ask you sort of your perspective on the impact on the German economy as a whole. You've touched on it a little bit, in terms of what you said about energy and the energy market. You touched on it a little bit when it comes to supply chains, but particularly given the role that the automotive sector plays in Germany and how important the automotive sector is for BASF, I'd be very interested in hearing sort of your thoughts on how the German economy is being impacted by this current crisis after the difficult few years that we've been through recently.
Well, I think it's a little bit more than just a supply chain crisis for the German automotive industry, because the automotive industry overall obviously is undergoing a huge change, and that is the shift from internal combustion engines to battery operated vehicles. And I think the future also of the German automotive industry will depend very much on how well we will be doing in this transition. Yeah. So, but when it comes to overall competitiveness of Europe, and that again has something to do with gas also. So, because we said we would refrain from purchasing the very cheap Russian gas, and we would shift more to LNG, and that will have an impact on the competitiveness of Germany. So if you look at the long run, and it's very simple, if you look at the long run marginal cost of LNG, so which is taking the Henry Hub price that I mentioned before, and I said it's above $7, but let's just say $6 per million BTU, then you need to liquefy it, you need to ship it, and then you also need to spend some money for regasification. So pipeline ready costs are probably in the magnitude of $12 per million BTU. That will be the European price, and it will have and we have to see whether it will have an influence on the Henry Hub price in the US in terms of netback pricing, or whether in Europe the price for gas will be 50% more expensive, and that would ultimately have some consequences, at least for some of the areas where we don't have an alternative.
Mm-hmm. So I have sort of two follow-up questions that relate to what you just said, and I let me preface it by saying I know that these are not necessarily topics that you are the expert on, but I think that they're both topics that you follow closely and where I'd be very interested in your take. One is, obviously, when it comes to the shift to LNG, one of the things that Olaf Scholz mentioned in his Zeitenwende speech was the need to build terminals so that Germany could have a place where this LNG could arrive and then be distributed. that the infrastructure has basically been lacking, and that this is something that cannot be introduced overnight. It's something that will take a little bit of time. So the question as it relates to the LNG terminals and distribution is how optimistic are you? How hopeful are you that this is something that can be done quickly in order to try to find an alternative to the Russian gas that Germany is so dependent on?
Well, quickly is always a relative term, right? I mean, I'm not sure whether I mentioned it. If not, I mentioned it again. Right now, the projection is that it will take us until the end of 24, beginning of 25 to have the infrastructure in place. Mm-hmm. And there is not a day goes by where the German government is not talking to foreign governments that would be willing or capable to ship LNG to Europe, or increasing at the same time production in Norway or in the Netherlands. So I think there will be options, but these options are not going to be there tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. And then the other question has to do with this comment that you made about the future of the automotive industry as a whole, and particularly Germany's automotive industry, as we overall make the transition from gasoline engines to electric cars. It seems in some senses as if German automobile manufacturers might be a little bit behind the curve and in some senses not moving quite as quickly as some might hope. What's your sense of this transition and where the German automotive industry is in terms of making this transition?
My sense is that we are on a good path. I mean, I think you are right that they were behind the 8 ball for a long time, but they have in the meantime made up considerable progress in order to accelerate that shift. Now, what remains to be seen now again is when you look at price escalations. Let's just take precious metal, right? And precious metal price determines then price for electric vehicles down the road. And you see at these huge price escalations, whether it's cobalt, lithium, nickel, or manganese, whether that is going to have now an impact on this initially faster than projected transition over to electric vehicles, because there will be quite a price escalation. Mm-hmm. And this escalation will only come down over time. Once you get into economies of scale, then right. Prices are supposed to come down. But right now, when you look at, like I said, look at these prices for precious metal, it's unbelievable where we are right now. Which is again, now we have to tie it back, right. Which is a function also of the conflict that we have in Russia and Ukraine.
Well, and you know, I guess there are two things to touch on there. One is, of course, how concerned are you, both through the lens of BASF, but also given what we were just talking about, how concerned are you about inflation? Because obviously prices are going up on a lot of commodities at the moment. Over time, hopefully some of these prices will come down, but it looks like there are some real shocks to the economy when it comes to inflation.
I mean, I think this year we will still be fine, I think, because there is still also some prepped up type of demand when I look at end consumer goods that where ultimately our products end up in. But then for next year, I think we will see a sharp decline in demand, yeah, and which is also because of an increase in inflation. So some of the durable goods, I mean, their demand ultimately has to come down.
So, I mean, Mike, we've talked obviously about sort of how your company, how BASF has been affected, to a certain degree, how Germany and the German economy has been affected, and also we've touched a little bit on the global dimension of the impact of where we are right now, and I'm curious what sort of lessons either can be drawn from this period as we look ahead and try to find solutions for challenges that are around the corner, but even more so, it seems as if we've been hit by, for lack of a better word, a double whammy of the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. And so are there lessons that you and your colleagues are drawing on from the first months of the pandemic that are actually helping to navigate the sort of choppy water that we're in at the moment when it comes to the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, Steve, good question. Again, I think it's a triple whammy. It's the COVID, it's the Ukraine problem, and then the third one is really the problems in the automotive industry, which are driven also by the chip crisis and now by the harness crisis driven by the Ukraine war. So what are some of the lessons learned? I think we clearly, all of us have learned how important it is to have a balanced type of regional structure for risk management at a company just as like BASF. And that means that it just goes back to what I said before, that we need to make sure that we have a very high representation in the countries where the markets are.
Mm-hmm. So related to that, I mean, one of the things that has been coming up in a number of conversations that I've been having that have more of a political dimension and that have related to Germany's G7 presidency has been sort of a growing divide between the sort of more advanced economies of the world and the global South, and that the global South has felt sort of left behind and not supported by the West, in both crises, the COVID crisis because they didn't really have access to vaccines, and now because they also see the food shortage that we were talking about at the outset affecting them in a pretty rough way as the conflict in Ukraine continues. To what degree are you active in some of these countries that make up the global South? And do you think there's a way of sort of bridging the divide that some people see coming down the pike there?
We are, Steve, we're active in all countries around the world. Yeah. And particularly when it comes to agrochemicals, I mean, all these countries are important to us. But we do a lot for smallhold farmers in countries in Africa, but also in smaller countries in South America or Asia. So this is our way to contribute also to help those farmers on the ground in those smaller type of countries in order to cope with the crisis. However, on a large scale, again, coming back to when you look at agriculture, I mean, certain crops are grown where you just have the best conditions in terms of soil, climate, et cetera, et cetera. So there is, unless we fix some of these problems that we have, that's right now in the Ukraine or Russia, there will be an impact independent of everything that we do on the ground in these smaller countries.
Mm-hmm. So perhaps related to that, I mean, I had a conversation this morning with someone from the Heinrich Böll Stiftung, which is close to the Green Party, and we were talking about the fact that climate change, concerns over climate change seem to be sort of pushed to the back burner at the moment because of the other crises that we're dealing with, and yet climate change is something that's not solved, that's not disappearing. And I know that BASF has really for years at this point been focused on sustainability questions and trying to make sure that you are taking a sustainable approach, that you're working with others to take a sustainable approach. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how sustainability efforts tie into everything else that you're doing at the moment in light of where we are?
Our company was founded in 1865, and the premise of the growth of our company has always been to build this Verbund structure, where basically whatever is used as garbage, let's say in one plant, can be used as a precursor in another. So I mean, sustainability, circularity has always been in the blood and DNA, let's say, of BASF. And when we talk about reducing the dependency of gas, that is also not new to us. It has been always part of our efforts to particularly to switch from gray to green energy. So I mentioned before that we use 50% of our gas to produce our own electricity. So, and we have announced our CO2 targets, which are pretty ambitious and they're independent of everything that's going on right now. So we want to reduce our CO2 targets by 25% compared to 2018 and then achieve a net zero by 2050. And why did we make that distinction? Because we say we have very clear plans until 2030. From 2030 to 2050, certain legislative type of changes have to happen. And some of the technologies that we are working on have to be implemented or have to be successful. So we, when it comes to energy needs and reducing CO2, there is a huge leverage, and it can be really done by producing electricity from renewable sources. So, and we need enormous quantities of green energy to achieve our climate targets. So, especially as our electricity needs will grow at the same time, because some of the technologies that I spoke about that also substitute gas in the future, for example, heating our cracker. So we have a cracker, which is basically the heart of a chemical plant. You use naphtha, and then you burn that, and then you heat that naphtha to 850 degrees, and then you split it up into individual components. The idea of us is to actually heat that cracker in the future with electricity. So, but that will increase also our electricity needs. So we expect that our global electricity need will double or even triple by 2050. So, and how are we tackling this? We have been very proactive way before the war has started and this crisis has started. And we have taken an equity stake in an offshore wind park in the Netherlands together with Vattenfall, what is going to be the largest wind park in Europe, and that will secure about 3 terawatt hours of electricity to BASF. And we are in the process also to bid for a second wind park, again, together with Vattenfall, also in the Netherlands.
So perhaps as we sort of start to come to a close, I mean, I think you know, this focus on renewables, it sounds like is nothing new. It's something that for BASF has been top of mind for a long time, because you've been able to anticipate your energy needs, your electricity needs into the future, and you know that you'll need more. And
to reduce CO2, because we produce electricity through gas, and so a huge portion of our CO2 emissions are coming actually from gas firing our electricity plants.
Right, right. And so you know, Germany, of course, over the years has set some pretty ambitious goals when it comes to renewables, and certainly now, in light of the conflict in Ukraine, it seems as if that has been sort of sped up. How realistic do you think some of these goals are? How achievable do you think that they are?
Well, it remains to be seen. You know, there for a long, long time, there was a saying that there is a snail in Germany, which actually traveled faster per year than our expansion of these high power lines, you know, going from north to south. What we see now is a much more conscious type of effort in order to get it done. I mean, to get the permissions done. I mean, to speed up, because at the end of the day, the green energy will be in the north, so it will be in the Northern Sea, and the need, you know, will be more in the throughout all of Germany, let's say, right? And you need to transport then that electricity from north to south. It will remain a challenge, though, because I think everyone in Germany is for it, as long as it's not in their backyard. Yeah, and the US has a huge advantage when it comes to infrastructure. And I always cite one example. When you build a highway in the US, you build 2 lanes to the left, 2 lanes to the right, and then you leave, let's say, 200 yards in the middle. So if you want to expand, you can always expand. Yeah. So in Germany, adding, one additional lane on an interstate highway is virtually impossible. Yeah. Mm. And that has something to do with that Germany has the size of Montana or half the size of Texas with over 80 million inhabitants. So, and that makes some of that really, really difficult. But I'm still hopeful that we get it done.
So maybe as a final question, because this often comes up in a German-American context, particularly given the moment in history that we're experiencing right now, the role of nuclear power in all of this. I cannot tell you how often the question comes up of why Germany does not keep the 3 remaining nuclear reactors online a little bit longer to try to deal with some of the electricity concerns and energy concerns that exist right now. One of our viewers actually wrote in a question asking, what about some of these new compact nuclear reactors and whether they could play a role in meeting some of the countries, some of your company's energy needs? Do you think nuclear can play a role at all, or is that over for Germany, given the decision by the previous government to pull out of nuclear power altogether, even though it means that Germany's power grid does get nuclear power from neighboring countries in Europe, so it's not completely independent.
Nuclear
power itself.
Some stuff is not necessarily always rational, right? I mean, we are against fracking, for example, of gas in Germany, but we are happily receiving fracked gas out of the United States. So, some of that stuff doesn't always make sense. I think when it comes to nuclear power, the train has left the station, meaning politically, it is not possible to revert that decision.
Mm-hmm. That's certainly what I hear from almost all of the politicians that I've had the opportunity to speak with when this question has come up. And I can tell you it comes up in almost every conversation, because there's inevitably somebody in the group who wants to know why those reactors don't stay online a little bit longer, particularly given the current crisis. And
I think it also has something to do, as far as I know, with some of the laws in Germany that in order to extend the lifetime, they would have to do major renewals of permits and stuff like that. I'm not an expert there, but I was always told that it's not possible.
But so I've been told that it's not possible from a regulatory standpoint. I've been told it's not possible from a practical standpoint of not having the raw materials in order to be able to extend the life of those plants, because they would have had to be ordered a much longer time ago. And
there is also a future conflict for you. A lot of the uranium is coming from Russia.
Yeah. So that makes sense. That would show yet again how one's dependent on Russia. So I do think that as you said, that the nuclear piece is over for Germany, and so Germany needs to come up with other solutions. And obviously, from everything that you've said at BASF, but in Germany as a whole, renewables really are that future. And so I think this is an exciting time, a challenging time, but it certainly sounds as if BASF has been thinking about the future for a much longer period of time than just the last couple of years and few months, and that this poses a great opportunity, but also some big challenges moving forward.
Definitely.
So, Michael, I just want to thank you again for taking the time to have this conversation with us. I think it's been really interesting to hear about how your company has been facing the myriad challenges that we face right now, but also it's been very helpful for us, at least, to put that in context of the impact on the German economy, but also on the global economy as a whole. So herzlichen Dank to you and to all of our viewers for tuning in today.
Thanks for having me, Steve, and have a good weekend, all of you.
Thank you. You do the same. Take care, and I look forward to seeing you again soon, Mike. Take care.
Bye-bye.